for health and safety.
Jami-Lee Ross.
I move that the question be now put.
I'm going to hear from Chris Farfoy.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. It's a pleasure to take a call on the Health and Safety Reform Bill Part 1. Can I thank the Minister and the Chair for answering a number of questions that were posed to him from this side of the House. There was one question that that Chris Hipkins posed that the Minister may have forgotten or did not address in his earlier statement that I'm certainly interested in too. And that is where businesses are of a size where they may or may not be caught, either under 20 or over 20. And there is a concern where, I guess, and I've had it from one business owner, where they may not be caught or may be caught, and other business units may be of a size of, let's say, 32, for example, may break into two separate business units so they aren't caught by this legislation. It is something that I certainly have spoken to one business in the building and construction sector. That business locally takes health and safety very seriously. And wants to make sure that they adhere to any health and safety regulation, but they also want to make sure that any other business that is competing with them can't necessarily game the system by separating into two business units so they aren't caught by this legislation. I guess if there's any safeguard or response that the government may have, then I certainly would be interested in hearing from the Minister for that. I think, Mr Chair, Mr Hipkins brought that up as part of Clause 3(1)(d). So I think if the Minister did have a response to that, that would be very useful. Mr Chair, I also want to move us to a different clause, and that is Clause 17, and that is the meaning of what is reasonably practicable. And I guess this is what you would expect under this piece of legislation that a good employer or a good workplace would do to take measures to mitigate any risk, especially in high-risk units, the workplaces, to prevent any injury or harm to their employees. And over the page, on page 32, Mr Chair, it talks about the availability and suitability of ways to eliminate or minimise the risk, and after assessing the extent of the risk and the available ways of eliminating or minimising the risk, the cost associated with available ways of eliminating risk, including whether the cost is grossly disproportionate to the risk. And I think this is a pretty key piece of this legislation, because for those firms that haven't done this kind of work, there have been, in many cases, deaths and injuries in their workplace. And I do want to acknowledge the family of Mark Samoa, who was a worker at the Centreport waterfront here in Wellington, who was killed at his workplace in January 2013. When the High Court made its decision to prosecute Centreport for his death, it said that Centreport had failed to have a procedure for the interaction between the pedestrians of the forklift, which dropped a bale, I believe, which crushed Mr Samoa at his workplace. And the judge found that because Centreport failed to have such a procedure for this work, it also failed to train, supervise, implement, monitor and communicate the procedure to its staff. Now, Mr Chair, I believe that this piece of legislation does give more safeguards to workers and does put the onus on employers to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again. But as has been said by many people on this side of the House, we believe that right should be available to all workers, not just workers of a business unit of a certain size, but to all workers, regardless of whether they work in a company that has staff of under 20 or over 20. Mr Chair, and I think this is something that those families of those victims seriously want to looked at. There's a very frank comment from Rhonda Samoa, the sister of Mark Samoa here. But when the verdict was passed out in that High Court case, she said, "I know human error was involved here, but there were not good enough measures in place to protect against that." She went on to say, "Unfortunately, it's taken a court case to give Centreport a good kick up the arse." Now, Mr Chair, on this side of the House, we're asking that the government seriously think about this, that we don't have to have another High Court case, that we don't have to have more deaths for businesses, such as in this case, Centreport, to get the kick in the arse that Rhonda Samoa suggested that company needed just to keep her brother safe in their workplace. Mr Chair, Clause 17 talks about the kind of protections, talks about the kind of reasonable steps that a company should take, Mr Chair.
Jami-Lee Ross.
I move that the question be now put.
Yes, we've had, members, we've had fair coverage of